Hi, my name's Spencer, and in today's TED Talk, the main focus of discussion will be Winston Churchill. And while many of us have probably heard the name Winston Churchill, a lot of us probably don't fully understand all of the things that he tied into his career and the accolades that he added along in his lifetime. So for starters, I'm going to go ahead and ask the audience, so what do you guys know about Winston Churchill? What makes him stand out to you guys?
Just like you said, I know who he is, but I really don't know much about everything that he did.
All right, well, that's perfect. We can, luckily for you guys, I will be diving into probably some of the biggest accomplishments that he had. So, for starters, his full name is actually Sir Leonard Winston Spencer Churchill. So, he formally goes by Winston Churchill, though. That's who we all know him as, and he was born on November 30th, 1874. Now, he was born into a long line of political figures. His father, his grandfathers, his uncles, they all held some sort of section, even back into post-revolutionary times, and even during like War of 1812 eras as well. So there's no lack of heredity in his future and success. On the contrary, however, though, in his early comings, he actually had some severe struggles with academics. He actually did not pass the exam to get into the Royal Military College the first time. He actually ended up having to take it 3 times before he ended up passing to enter. And then from there, he did kind of get back on track, and he did end up graduating 20th in his class. So post-graduation, he ended up taking a life as a soldier. And at this time, it was in Cuba is where he started out. And in Cuba is where he first started his journalism. He started to write some entries, things along this nature. Eventually, he ended up going to South Africa, where, yet again, he lived a life as a soldier. His big thing he took away from all of this was his writings. He really was truly a brilliant author, and we'll discuss that later on in this presentation, but his writings are one of the things that he's most known for, while many of us might not even know it. Okay, but moving on, so he eventually tried his hand in politics in 1899 after so many years in various locations in Cuba and South Africa, where he ended up did not win the election his first go-around. So after that, he goes back to his life as a soldier. He goes back to South Africa. He's still writing. He's publishing things. He ends up making around £10,000, which back then, unfortunately, I don't know the conversion right off the top of my head, but I would imagine it would be quite a lump sum in today's economy. Along with that, with the wealth and riches that he had made from an author, he had a heroic expedition where he basically played rescue man in South Africa, where he ended up freeing hundreds of prisoners, British soldiers, from a lockaway train. Now, the negative from this mission was that he ended up getting captured during this, and he ended up being held hostage for a month. To even add on to this heroic expedition, Winston Churchill escaped from the South African prison, returned home, and returned a glorious hero. With this newly found wealth that he had received from his writings, as well as the national popularity that he earned from this mission that he had partaked in and rescued all these soldiers, he retried his luck in an election upcoming, and this time he was fortunate enough to win. So now with this election that he won, he did end up becoming a part of Parliament, which was Winston Churchill's ideology, I think, from basically from when he can remember. I think he always had the idea, coming from the family line of so many political figures, so many people that had power and authority, I believe it just kind of came along with him in his DNA and his blood. So after that, he went through various roles. He worked his way up in the government, or parliament we call it. But he also had a moment where he took a step back from all of it and he really just became a soldier again. Now this is where it's kind of difficult to say exactly what his reasoning behind this was. My best guess would be that he was probably doing it for the experience of his writings and his journaling. I think he truly found a very close connection with writing. I think deep down, one of his major components as a character was the fact that he was an author, that his words were his power. He was an artist of the English language. So, but eventually he did go back and he made it to a very prestigious role of Admiral of the Navy. And he, unlike others, did see an inevitable Second World War. So obviously Winston Churchill was fully alive during the First World War. He even was a soldier during parts of it. He was also in the government during parts of it, so there was kind of a mixed period. But he did end up becoming Admiral of the Navy. He foresaw a Second World War, and this is when he started to bulk up the Navy. He swore and swore that they needed to make sure that they were ready for wartime. So it was more of like an arms race. He stood by it. And during his time as Admiral, he did create some lasting relationships that would eventually possibly even be huge deciding factors in the war. And the two main alliances that he formed were with no other than Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union and as well as Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the United States. In 1939, Germany had declared war. And this was the time where he took to the step where he was basically the second-hand man in the British government or parliament. So he was just below the prime minister. In May of 1940, the current prime minister realized that his time basically had been gone. His health was decreasing. He was not in the current position to take on the challenge ahead. And to be truthful, from my research, I did find that there was a second candidate that was actually supposed to be taken above Churchill to take over the prime minister role. However, the prime minister at the time understood and he saw the spark that Churchill brought and he saw the spark in the people when Churchill spoke. He made the executive decision that Churchill would take to the position as prime minister in May of 1940. So that kind of gives you the background story of where he came from, what his life was, his early adulthood, and then how he got to that penultimate position of prime minister, where that's where we all know him as. He was the prime minister during World War II, one of the most difficult positions in all of history, one could debate. So the next section we'll be moving into, like I said, I would revisit, was the literature. So for starters, I think it's important to note that he did in fact win a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. Many didn't know that. I've talked with several, they had no clue that he had actually won a Nobel Prize, and many probably don't. And this was towards the end of his life. He died in the mid-1960s. This was well after his prime, 8 years after the war, so I could understand how this gets brushed under the radar. However, one of the most famous works of literature, that was actually his first speech as prime minister, and it came immediately following the invasion of Germany in France. And he said to his people, "I have nothing but blood, toil, and tears to offer to this country." And at first you kind of hear it and you're not fully sure, but then you take the second look and you kind of like dissect it and decipher every little bit of it. He's basically saying that it is all for Britain. He has nothing less. He will literally put every ounce of being into this country, into this war, into making sure that all of the people back home are safe, into making sure that Britain as an entity lingers on and remains as one of the well-known industrialized, flourishing countries of the era of the time. And this is where I kind of related this back to one of the topics that we discussed in this course, and it was the crucible idea from Bennis and Thomas, where they wrote kind of about leaders will be put into situations that are so stressful and so difficult that it almost acts as a catalyst. It's almost kind of like the idea of sink or swim. When someone's put into that situation, are they able to prevail and rise above the occasion to make sure that they're there for their people and they're a strong leader and they give the great portrayal that of strength and bravery? Or do they falter under the pressure? I can confidently say that Winston Churchill, better than just about anybody in history, completely prevailed during his time of stress. One of the other most important, I shouldn't say important, that's kind of, I would say, recognized speeches and quotes that he has was when France actually indeed fell. And he did say that it is time for us, our duty, that so be it, that Britain as a country practically, we're not talking Britain as an idea, I mean as a country, as an existing thing, if it would to last 1,000 years on this huge invasion of Nazi Germany, which was at this point France had basically was non-existent. It was basically Nazi France at that point. So he comes out with this speech and he says, it is our duty to stand here, and if Britain would to last another 1,000 years, this would be our finest hour. And it's almost kind of sends like goosebumps down your spine. You get like chills. It's brilliant use of words. The literature that he had, you could just understand why people would listen to him and be motivated and changed. And even in their fear, they feel confidence. And even in inevitable doom, they feel bravery. And I think that's kind of the reason why he was so successful in what he did. It wasn't the fact that he was a brilliant war hero like other past leaders. He did have stories and he had that rescue mission, but he was never known for his unbelievable army tactics or military instincts. Winston Churchill was solely an orator that used literature as his weapon. He used this as the spark. He used this to kindle the flame of his entire country, his people. Not just the soldiers. He used this to spark the people back home that were in the factories, the people providing the food. He did this everywhere to where it was a complete, unanimous sensation that spread throughout the country that Churchill was the leader and we were all fighting behind him. And I think that was the real true key of a brilliant leader. And based on that, I also related this back to Menk's realistic optimism discussion and his articles about that, where it's no mystery that Winston Churchill was definitely standing in severe fear. There's no doubt he was worried. Nazi Germany posed a threat that some may have never seen stopping. I mean, there was a true time where Europe was about to be completely taken over. And in fact, it's suggested that had Hitler not created a two-front war, which is the exact same thing that happened in World War I, when he had Operation Barbarossa and he invaded Soviet Russia, he had a two-front war. He was fighting on the front lines of Britain and he was fighting on the front lines of Germany. Not to add that later on that FDR, no coincidence that he was basically at this point close, intimate friends with Winston Churchill. He even added on to the fight, which at this point was a world threat. But the idea was the realistic optimism. He portrayed this sense of hope, this sense of pride, this sense of courage, when none was really easily to be found. And yet again, that just adds on to his legacy. I mean, I think it's easy and I'm comfortable to say that Churchill spoke and he led in a way that wasn't just for his lifetime. It carried on. It lingered beyond him. He left a legacy over the British generation. So in closing, I would like to say that I didn't really mention much, but I would like to at least hint on he did have a very close relationship with FDR back in the United States. At one point, he ended up coming over to Washington around the beginning of December, and he actually ended up staying at the White House with FDR until post-Christmas. He ended up staying there, I think, for about 3 or 4 weeks, and Eleanor, the First Lady, I read in some of the research that I had, was not too happy and was not sure that he was going to be staying that long, because obviously FDR and Churchill would be staying up and sharing drinks and obviously discussing on future implications. But nonetheless, it definitely adds to the overall character that he built, the great alliance with the United States, and FDR being the great leader that he was for this country, where he kind of ensured that the world, not just Britain, was safe, but the world was safe. And I think that was the not really the deciding factor for him, but just one of the many that made him the great leader that he was. All right. And with that being said, that will be the end of the discussion. Are there any questions before I sign off? No? All right. Thank you for your time.